Good evening, one and all, and welcome to the INSS. This evening, based on research and very deep thought that have been carried out for the last 2 years here at our institute, to think about a different strategic direction for the State of Israel that would promote our national interests. We sincerely hope that those proposals that will be brought here this evening will be a foundation for a very extensive public discourse and a preferred direction in our negotiations with the Palestinians in our attempt to solve those problems. We're not a political institute, but it is responsible to research, and that is its main aim, to reach national strategy that would promote the interests of the State of Israel. And here we're talking about an integration of a state that is not only Jewish, but democratic, also secure, legitimate, and just. If we could have achieved all that simultaneously, we certainly would have walked in that direction. But even when you can't aim to get everything simultaneously, then you have to look at each parameter at the highest priority and to find the trade-off and the right admixture amongst all the components of the national security of the State of Israel. Over the last year, when John Kerry started that process for negotiations to reach a final status agreement between the Palestinians and Israel, we evaluated that possibility to reach that agreement was very low. The gap in those core issues were unbridgeable. At least in our eyes, it seemed. The maximum that each side would be able to extricate to go towards the other side did not match the minimum that each side asked for. The public opinion of both sides was not ready for compromises, the minimal ones that were necessary, and the leaders did not know how to bring their whole public behind them to such a place where they would be able to reach an agreement. Both the leaders took their time before they actually managed to reach things, and they started it with total trust on both sides and a sort of restrictive trust or partial one in the American mediator. The greatest tragedy of all is that we all know what the parameters are of a peace agreement that we could achieve if it is achieved. These parameters were determined by President Clinton in 2000 and presented by Israel by Prime Minister Barak in the year 2000, and again with various minor changes by Prime Minister Olmert in the negotiations at Annapolis in 2007-2008. And the need and the ability to reach an agreement based on these parameters still exist if it is fine-tuned and adapted to the geopolitical situation, which is different in 2014, and also if we're looking ahead to what is happening and developing in the Middle East. In this slide, one can see the three main concessions, the most painful ones that each of both sides needs to do. And blue is Israel, brown is the Palestinians. The State of Israel is required to concede Greater Israel, a state between the Jordan and the sea, and accept that there are going to be two states between the Jordan and the sea. I think that is already behind us, even in the Bar Ilan lectures that we heard from the Prime Minister. It is harder to accept that the border between those two states is going to be the 67 border, although Udi in the previous panel said from what he knows and that the Prime Minister has already accepted that principle too. But the toughest of all that was not accepted by Rabin but yes, by Barak and Olmert, was the partition of Jerusalem. These are three very painful concessions. The Palestinians also need to. They have to recognize that the peace agreement is the end of all demands and the conflict. And the second one, and that is a recognition of Israel as a homeland of the Jewish people. They have to recognize, if we say it in soft words, that the refugees are only going to come back to a Palestinian state and not to Israel. And if we say so a little more bluntly, that the right of return is not acceptable. And they also have to agree to a sovereignty with various restrictions that emanate from the security arrangements that Israel is demanding. Now, these are the three main painful concessions that contradict the historical narrative, the Israeli, the Jewish ones, and the Palestinian one, their national aspirations, their religious aspirations and belief, their sense of justice, and the way wherein they see history and the practical lessons that they have learned from the way things have run and the various events over the last generations. To my chagrin, I have to say that a final status agreement, it is much harder to be achieved than it was in the year 2000 or even in 2008. Even when I was the head of the military intelligence, and it was my role to observe the Palestinians, I understood that even the most moderate of them, and especially now, when the unity with the Hamas is the leading card, they're not willing to concede their right of return, nor the end of their demands, nor to accept a Jewish homeland, nor to enable Jewish control, Israeli control in the Jordan Valley or aerial territory. There was a public survey carried out by the Washington Institute, published just last week, that shows, in contradiction to what we used to say in the INSS, that the two-thirds of the Palestinians and two-thirds of the Israelis are willing to arrange a two-state solution. But they simply haven't found the right equation. The leadership hasn't brought them to it. Unfortunately, in that kind of referendum, it was a sort of the Washington's referendum, if they do reach some kind of agreement, 60% of them said that what they want to achieve is the historical Palestine from the Jordan to the sea, and only a quarter of the Palestinians, and to actually reach that kind of one state, sort of that kind of solution that we would reach through a status quo, a very low percentage agreed to. So one has to understand, if you analyze all that the Palestinians have not moved from their positions as were presented in all the last negotiation rounds. They are fixed in their rounds as they were in the last 15 years, while in Israel there have been all sorts of fluctuations, especially during the period from Barak to Taba and from Taba to Annapolis, especially with Netanyahu has brought things back to that and said that when nothing is agreed, it's only because we can't agree to anything unless everything has been agreed on, basically. The Palestinians have a very attractive Plan B. Penina mentioned it here. And in the center of that agreement, it means totally condemning Israel in the international arena, the negating of its legitimacy, and in fact accepting everything that is written in blue without giving what is written in brown. In other words, Jerusalem as a capital of the big Palestinian state without any of their painful concessions in a peace agreement. That is something that overtakes Israel. It's basically a lane, a direction that goes straight to the international arena so that they will receive their international sort of self-determination rights. In other words, everything that happened in the lack of compromise in the negotiations, the way everything happened was through an assumption that if the negotiations fail, they still have their contingency plan, Plan B, and that was to go and knock on the doors of the international arena. Here they were reinforced. They were reinforced from everyone who said that we only have two options. And if you read the idea of President Obama's idea with Jeffrey Goldberg, he said at the end of the interview that they have two options, either status quo, wherein it will be a bitter state of conditions with one state, a very problematic one, they will be a sanctioned country, or there'll be a peace agreement. And the Palestinians said, okay, let it be that indeed the assumption that the negotiations will fail is terrible for Israel, but it isn't necessarily bad for us. And therefore they think it's a win-win situation. Either we will accept their conditions for peace, or the status quo will be dragged out and continue, and there will be claims again, arguments against us from Europe and the United States, and that Israel will be in dire straits, but not necessarily for the Palestinians. And therefore I'm claiming here this evening from this podium that there are four options and not only two, and we ought to explore them and examine them. There are two peace agreements. There is one, according to the Palestinian parameters, wherein they do retain the right of return and the security arrangements will not be sufficient, wherein there is no recognition of the end of the conflict. In other words, if you give us whatever you can give us, and we will continue the conflict after that, and we will not recognize a Jewish homeland, and we'll have other prerequisites and all other things that are connected to the right of return and the historic narrative. But there is an agreement. I call it Israeli parameters. Not all the Israelis support it, but what I presented as the parameters of Clinton, which I believe is an agreement that we could live with. But the Israelis are not willing for the blue, and the Palestinians are not willing to accept the green. And that is what happened over the last year. We didn't succeed in reaching a peace agreement over the last year that would be something that would be in between the green and the blue. And what I'm claiming this evening is that Israel must have its contingency plan, its plan B. It must have an alternative plan, because we do not want to remain in that status quo. Anyone who wants to remain in that status quo doesn't need a contingency plan. But the status quo long term, and that's why I'd like to open parentheses for a moment. I do not belong to that group of people who are terrified of status quo, who think that we would be lost in it. I think, on the other hand, that it is something not desirable, and that long term it will lead us to rather undesired territory kind of thing. And if we do not run ourselves in a proper manner, then the status quo with incorrect policy could in fact enhance delegitimization processes, sanctions, divestment, and other things, wherein a state where democratic and other values will not be retained and preserved. So therefore, I think, as we did at other crossroads in the history of Zionism, we need to take the initiative and move to a proactive policy, stop wasting time and start acting in such a way that time will be in our favor and not against us. At the core of the Israeli Plan B, the contingency plan, where one cannot reach peace, is to mold reality of two states by ourselves. A reality wherein we will maximize those four components that I just mentioned at the beginning of my speech: a Jewish state, a democratic state, a secure, safe state, and a legitimate, just state. That is a step that retains the vitality of a solution for two-state solution. And if you can't, And if we can't reach an agreement, that is something that we need to promote in order to reach those parameters that we believe are the correct ones. And every parameter that we can implement by ourselves, we should take with both hands and implement. We're not talking about a unilateral policy, but rather independent, coordinated. And the coordination, by the way, is of paramount importance with the international arena. And then after that, if the Palestinians understand that the Israelis do have an alternative and they're not stuck between a bad status quo and a bad agreement, the devil in the deep blue sea, they might even agree to go with us. In other words, it's a third option. Now this, it does not make it actually the negotiations redundant, but it may any other agreements redundant too. On the contrary, it leaves all the doors open, but we will reach that target with an open door as long as we haven't got a partner. But if a unilateral step in Israel, does it have a bad history? Does it have a negative connotation? We remember that unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000 that seemed terrible. It seemed as if we were running away. And we remember that withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, which was followed by the barrage of mortars and rockets on the south, which is now on its way to Tel Aviv. And now I'd like to ask if anyone here in this room wants to go back to South Lebanon or Gaza Strip, please put your hands up. No one does. That's what happens in all my lectures when I say that. And therefore, these two unilateral steps of Barak and Sharon were strategically correct. They improved Israel's strategic position, and they were done badly. And therefore, like in the core that I come from the intelligence, one needs to investigate. One needs to debrief and to see what happened after the various sorties in 2000 and 2005 and to do it better next time. So therefore, let us look at the four main mistakes. I've got 10, but let us look at the main mistakes in the unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip. The first one was the fact that there wasn't enough external or internal legitimacy when we did it. In order to take a unilateral step, in order to receive legitimacy, you need to preempt it by a very generous peace proposal based on the parameters that I presented here. Israel must present either unilaterally as a proposal on the table, or if the negotiations start again, a proposal that would be generous to the other side. It would include concessions, but also demands from the other side, like, for example, that red column that I showed you beforehand. In other words, not security, not refugees, and not on the end of all the conflict. Those are the three concessions that we're not going to actually concede to. So, to my estimate, we are going to take a step wherein we will have legitimacy. The world will understand how ready Israel was for an agreement and how, to what degree the other side was to be blamed for the not reaching an agreement. And therefore, we need to help have the whole sort of share it all with the international arena. What is better, that status quo, or actually stabilizing, actually declaring a situation where there are two states? And the logic underlying it for the international arena would be to support the two-state solution. Now, in 2005, we left an open corridor for the smuggling of weapons into the Gaza Strip, which actually turned it into an Iranian base which is flooded with every possible kind of weaponry from Libya, Sudan, Egypt, and Iran. We must not forget the Philadelphia axis. And now in the Jordan Valley, we have to remember that that has to remain in the hands of Israel, and this will prevent the smuggling into Judea and Samaria. There has to be a complete separation between the end of the occupation and a period of time until it becomes an independent actual government, so in order to prevent the building of a Hamas army in those territories. Now, when we vacated the land, we said it okay because we're going to legitimize the end of the occupation. I've got news for you. Even if we did actually withdraw from the entire territory, Israel did not receive recognition of the end of the recognition. On the other hand, it was left without bargaining chips whatsoever. We are preparing ourselves on that security fence, or at least close as possible to us, leaving the main settlement blocks in the field plus other strategic sites, and some of those territories will be the bargaining chips for future negotiations if the Palestinians are willing to come back to that table of negotiations. The fourth mistake was a complete disconnection between the leadership steps and the public that was going to be evacuated. The public in general, and in particular, the public that was about the evacuation. In other words, this lack of national coordination led a situation that even 9 years post the disengagement, there have still not found real solutions for them from a residential point of view. In other words, there wasn't a referendum, there wasn't discussions, there wasn't something that was truly legitimately accepted within Israel. When you evacuate settlements, you need that legitimacy, or like, for example, in the Sadot and Yamit area when we had the peace agreement with Egypt, or there should be some kind of step that would be validated by the entire people, and it has to be graduated and then over time accepted. So if this is taken, these steps are taken by the INSS has recommended, then if we accept those parameters that we believe should be anchored in the negotiations, it should be a very generous suggestion on the issue of the borders. It should be the end of the conflict, and there would be no substantiation of the desire for the right of return. Now, based on this Israeli proposal, or based on the renewal of the actual negotiations with the mediation of the Americans, then there should be no prerequisites, no preconditions. Instead of creating trust, they actually had a detrimental effect on it, and therefore it has to be done in a different way. There has to be meetings of the leaders. In the 9 months of those negotiations, the Prime Minister and the President of the Palestinian Authority did not meet even once. Both sides must create trust so that they understand the needs of the other side, create creative ideas in order to mediate the differences and bridge the gaps between them. This negotiation must be between the two sides, and not the two sides with the American Secretary of State. And that's what happened. Dozens of meetings with the American teams, and very few amongst themselves, the two sides. They have to try and also involve the moderate Arab states with the leadership of Jordan, Egypt, and the Emirates. In other words, that a zero-sum game between us and the Palestinians, which will make things so difficult to reach an agreement, could change if additional values and cards are put on the tables by the moderate Arab state.
We should expect from the Arab countries to support processes of reaching agreement and will not strengthen the authority only when it objects and opposes to come to some compromise. The Arab peace plan, in the way it is presented today, cannot be a basis or a framework for negotiations, because it's a take it or leave it kind of plan, and it includes also the return of the Golan Heights. However, if this plan will be updated and will be a basis for negotiations and not a dictation of the results, then I think that here again we have a new framework and a new paradigm for the negotiation and the capability to reach an agreement. If we don't reach an agreement, the State of Israel will lead a long-term plan for an independent stability of the borders, coordinating with its allies, and if I said also with the Palestinians if possible. The plan will show willingness to give up the requirement of sovereignty of 80 to 90% of the West Bank, a willingness which will be reflected in real steps in the field. The State of Israel will redeploy itself, and it will be based on a separation wall, security wall, maintaining the Jordan Valley and Jerusalem in our hands. The B zones will be transferred to the Palestinians as well as some of the C areas. The fence will be completed in places which it's not today, and will have a defensible border this way. We'll stop building the settlements beyond the line that was defined, but it will not stop in the clusters of settlements. We will operate and plan in long term, hopefully with an agreement, the evacuation of the settlers. It's a long-term process to bring them back to the State of Israel, with preference to the Negev and the Galilee, who are longing for inhabitants, also a possibility for anybody who wants to stay in the settlements to remain there. The responsibility for security will be in the hands of the IDF, as it is today. We will maintain the capability. We don't have to agree on that with anybody, because this process is independent. We are going to maintain our capability for preventive activities, for pursuit, and to maintain our borders by land, by sea, and in the air. And of course, the IDF activities will be as less as possible. We are aware of the fact that the proposal is not perfect, but strategy is the choice between alternatives. This alternative seems to us better than the status quo, and better than reaching an agreement in unreasonable parameters. I'll tell you what are the weak points of this plan, because we thought about it quite a lot. But I'm saying it anyway, so that we can get in the public discussion that I hope develops also additional proposals in order to strengthen these weak points. Our main weak point is the political feasibility in Israel for an agreement that this is the right step. It doesn't exist at the moment. The right sees in that the surrender to the Palestinians, transferring unilaterally territories, and the left is appalled by the idea that you cannot reach an agreement with the Palestinians and that we have to make unilateral steps. And the entire population doesn't feel that the status quo is so problematic. The second point is the capability to, the second weak point is the capability to mobilize the international community to this process. It's not self-evident. However, I think that the international community, if it is convinced that this strategy is the only one which can preserve the option of two states, as opposed to the status quo that they argue causes the fact that the two-state solution is going to become irrelevant with time. There's some people who already announced it today that it's irrelevant. The change in the policy of settlement that is worrisome for the international community, changing the vector of the settlements from continuing to being evacuating, this is a good point held by the international community. The third point is, how do we evacuate the settlements? In the State of Israel, there's a great fear from evacuating settlements, and the orange-colored ones who were against the evacuation in Gaza succeeded. No government since the Sharon government ever dared deal with this issue, and we think that this issue is possible. It is a huge challenge to the society in Israel, but it is a multi-annual and a social and a political and operational challenge. And we have to continue with the security outline. There's quite a tension between the principle of preserving most of the security in the hands of the IDF and the wish to create a situation of two states and end of occupation. We will be happy to hear in the panel that will follow me the words of 4 senior people, members of Knesset, how it is possible to cope with these points. To summarize, our target is to obtain a Jewish majority in a democratic Jewish state. And our recommendation in 2014, the strategic recommendation we gave in the beginning of this year, we recommended a grand strategy for the State of Israel. And we said that the grand strategy has three legs in the political security aspects. Flexibility regarding the Palestinian issue in order to mobilize the United States and the Sunni Arab countries to grapple with the Iranian issue, to create a front of the United States, Israel, and moderate states, Arab states, to grapple with this heavy challenge, which is Iran. What we're proposing today is realization of some of this grand strategy in order to achieve flexibility in the Palestinian component, after unfortunately we did not manage to get to a peace agreement. And therefore we are required to have new paradigms, to shape ourselves, our own borders, if we cannot reach an agreement of two states, to reach a reality of two states at least. All this with independent steps that are not contradictory to a negotiation for peace if other conditions prevail. One of the principles of this plan, in my opinion, it's going to take out the Palestinians from their obstinacy and the extreme position they're holding, because they'll understand that the State of Israel has a real option, other relevant option. And I think that the new paradigms to promote and preserve the idea of two states are necessary to stop the erosion in the moral, political, and economical position of the State of Israel. This one unilateral shape of the borders is a second alternative to a better agreement, but it's better than the status quo, or to have an agreement with unreasonable parameters that don't give us security, the end of conflict, and the fact that there's no right of return. We have to change the perception that time is against us. We should retake the initiative and to fill the batteries of legitimacy of the State of Israel. Shaping the borders is the Israeli interest. We're not doing it for the Palestinians. We're doing it for ourselves, to shape our own borders. And we're doing it out of a position of strength. The State of Israel today, from a security point of view, is in a very good position to these steps. We're not running away from terror. We won over the terror. We prevailed. It didn't take us 6 days. It didn't take 6 weeks or 6 months. But after 6 years, we won over the terror, and we can afford to do something out of optimism, strength, and an attempt to direct the state to the right place. We're talking about a long-term plan. It's not going to take a month nor a year. But this is a plan that will shape a correct State of Israel. It will preserve the solution of the two states by agreement, and it will change the facts on the field that, on the face of it, will prevent in the future the solution of the two states. Zionism overdreamt on an impossible future, and it strove to achieve it, and it did. I think that in our generation as well, we can do the same. Thank you very much.